The oppression of the Sith will never return. You have lost.
No. 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 You have died! He's a traitor!
He is the traitor!
I have the power to save the one you love. You must choose.
Don't listen to him, Anakin!
Don't let him kill me. I can't hold it any longer. I can't. I'm weak. Too weak. Anakin! Help me! I can't hold on any longer.
I am going to end this once and for all.
You can't. He must stand trial.
He has control of the Senate and the courts. He's too dangerous to be left alive.
I'm too weak. Don't kill me, please.
It's not the Jedi way. He must live.
Please don't.
I need him.
Please don't. No!
So hi again everyone, and welcome back for the last episode of this series. So, in the previous episode, I had a little look at some of the parallels between liberalism and fascism. Specifically, how fascism seeks to preserve a liberal capitalist economic order and social hierarchy, but to enforce it with violence and a rejection of the social and political values of liberalism. Now I want to go a bit further and show how this relationship can, and does, lead liberal administrations to lay the ground for fascism, whether intentionally or not. And obviously, we have seen they do this pretty actively in other people's countries, when they're installing third world dictatorships and so on. But here we're talking about how liberal regimes lay the ground for fascism in their own country. I am not saying that these liberal contradictions are the only cause for fascism, or the only useful lens through which to examine it. Obviously, many forces come together to force the dramatic horrors of fascism. I am saying that, as we saw in the last video, liberalism does contain the seeds of fascism within it. And understanding where these are, and which directions of travel from there lead to disaster, is, in my view, incredibly important if we want to be able to recognise and prevent such atrocities in the future. As I argued in the previous section, fascism is, seen from one angle, an attempt to protect the property relations and economics of capitalism from the threat of redistribution by mass socialist forces. In this way, it is an intensification and absolute prioritisation of the economics of liberalism, while rejecting its social and political tenets. As we saw, Ishay Landa, in his book The Apprentice's Sorcerer, which is the core of the source material for this miniseries, sees this relationship as like the apprentice in the classic story, who, having animated the brooms, loses control as the brooms multiply and must call on the authority of the sorcerer to restore order and discipline to the errant brooms. In this way, liberalism's social and political values animate the masses, who then attempt to move beyond their subservient role in the economic system. And so liberalism must call on the authority of fascism, the politics of might and force, to reassert the economic hierarchy. Perhaps the first modern historical event which reflects this is in fact not a government usually counted as fascist, but one which Landa argues may offer a prototype for this process, that being the rise of Louis Napoleon, or Napoleon III, to take power in France after the 1848 revolution. He rose to power as president in a military coup in 1848, and later declared himself Emperor of France, forming a military dictatorship in 1852. Landa argues this process followed very much the form we are examining here, a shutting down of the social and political aspects of liberalism to fight off attacks on its economic status quo by the working class. We saw earlier, in episode 2, the French liberal Alexis de Tocqueville attacking democracy for threatening the regime of private property, bemoaning how, "On every side we see strange doctrines appearing, which all deny the right of property. Who can fail to recognise in this the last symptom of the old democratic disease of the times, whose crisis is perhaps approaching? This rejection of democracy by a liberal in fear of socialist reforms being enacted by democracy was made in a speech to the French Parliament in October 1847, and, while de Tocqueville himself did not actively promote a dictatorship, his anti-democratic, anti-socialist positions, spoken in a public arena, clearly contributes to an atmosphere of thought in which it's easy to see how a dictator would become the solution. And praise for the new dictatorship was forthcoming from various liberal sources after the coup. Remember the British liberal and key constitutional thinker, Walter Bagehot? Well, he was actually a foreign correspondent in Paris at the time of the 1848 coup. Let's see what he has to say through a few extracts from his reports. Louis Napoleon is, as a pointed writer describes him, a superior man, but his superiority is of the sort that is hidden under a dubious exterior. He thinks and does not discuss. He decides and does not deliberate. He acts without agitation. He speaks and assigns no reason. His best friends are unacquainted with him. He obtains their confidence, but never asks for it. And you will not be misled by any high-flown speculations about liberty or equality. You will, I imagine, concede to me that the first duty of a government is to ensure the security of that industry which is the condition of social life and civilized cultivation. It is from this state of things, whether by fair means or foul, that Louis Napoleon has delivered France. The effect was magical. Commerce instantly improved. New Year's Day, when all the boulevards are one continued fair, has not, as I am told, been for some years so gay and splendid. People began to buy, and consequently to sell. So Bagehot, the celebrated liberal constitutional scholar, wholly endorses Napoleon III's coup, specifically for how it has protected commerce. He even comments on the events that led up to this, showing his distinct preference for the bourgeois over the impoverished masses who had risen up the previous June to demand their share of property and power. He describes the socialists as practical rascals and energetic murderers, and describes their bourgeois state-backed opposition, rather euphemistically, as mostly solid shopkeepers, 3 parts ruined by the events of February, who fought, I will not say bravely or valiantly, but furiously, frantically, savagely, as one reads in old books that half-starved burgesses in beleaguered towns have sometimes fought for the food of their children. Let any sceptic hear of the atrocities of the friends of order and the atrocities of the advocates of disorder, and he will, I imagine, no longer be sceptical on 2 points. He will hope that if he ever have to fight, it will not be with a fanatic socialist, nor against a demi-bankrupt, fighting for his shop. Ishay Landa offers an especially well-expressed analysis of this quote, so rather than paraphrasing, I will give you his words directly. The historical appeal to the starving medieval burgess creates in the reader the impression that the bourgeois were hungry, whereas the workers were merely bloodthirsty. The actual situation is thereby ingeniously reversed, in which the workers of Paris, left unemployed en masse after the closing of the national workshops, were the ones actually fighting for their and their children's daily bread. The flashback to the encircled burghs is also misleading, in that, in June 1848, the workers were those finding themselves in a beleaguered town. So Bagehot is perfectly happy to throw starving workers under the bus, and even endorse a coup against the workers' interests to secure the interests of the bourgeois and their economic system. The social values are irrelevant when property is threatened. Whether it is the intended outcome or not, the attitude of the bourgeois can be seen to have prepared the ground for the taking of dictatorial power and the abandonment of an agenda of political rights, ushering in the sorcerer of a proto-fascist regime to reassert order. As I mentioned in the previous video, this effect is also clearly seen in Italian fascism, where Mussolini, far from being elected, was invited by the king to form a government to protect establishment interests. But of course, unlike in Italy, or in France in 1848, Hitler did rise to power through the electoral system, although he never won an outright majority, but he was able to use the German electoral system to secure power through democracy. So do we see this effect of liberals, intentionally or otherwise, ushering in fascism in the case of Hitler? One way we could see this happening is with a tactic we have not yet discussed in depth: triangulation. I mentioned it with Blair in episode 3, but I'd like to have a look at it again here. This is where a political party chooses to adopt policies outside of their perceived ideological scope, and specifically here, where a liberal left party adopts a traditionally fascist view in order to try and appeal to fascist voters and neutralise them as an electoral threat. We saw Tony Blair doing this with immigration in episode 3, and of course, Hillary Clinton in the last episode. We see this in Weimar Germany in the run-up to Nazism, notably in the DVP, the Deutsche Volkspartei, or the German People's Party, who were formed from a union of the National Liberal Party, the Free Conservative Party, and the Economic Union, so strong liberal pretensions here, and clearly, in some ways, on the economic side. They chose to adopt a sort of softer version of anti-Semitism, a racism-light stance, if you will, rather like Blair did with immigration, in order to try and attract Nazi voters and pull these aberrant fascists back to the liberal centre. Obviously, it didn't work. The Nazis grew stronger, and they shifted further right, and come 1933, the party's chairman, Eduard Dingelday, had to fight off calls for an actual merger with the Nazi party with difficulty. And we can see the effects of this in more detail, and some more examples of the liberal-fascist relationship, if we look at the actual election results of 1933 and the preceding elections. Many commentators have suggested that Nazism was supported by the socialist-inclined working classes, and that fascism was therefore some sort of mass working-class hysteria and was defined by its opposition to liberalism. The free-market capitalist Friedrich von Hayek forwards this position, saying about the Nazis, "The real enemy, the man with whom they had nothing in common, is the liberal of the old type." We saw in the previous episode how this theory about the socialist nature of Nazism doesn't hold up when we examine what the actual economic conditions were under Nazism, but it also posits that it was, in some ways, the working class, the natural constituency of the socialist parties, that drove the Nazi rise to power. However, this argument still does not hold up to examination when we look at the actual election results that brought the Nazis to power. Here we see the election results in terms of Reichstag seats by party from 1928 to 1933. We can see that the KPD and the SPD, the Communist and Social Democratic parties respectively, i.e. the working class socialist parties on the left, maintain a steady share of the vote, keeping about a third of the Reichstag between them. The parties that seem to lose the most seats are in fact the DVP, who, as we discussed before, were engaged in triangulation with the Nazis, whose vote dwindled to give them a mere 2 seats in 1933, and the DDP, the Deutsche Demokratische Partei, the left-of-centre Liberal Party, who are reduced to 5 seats. And of course, we see the NSDAP, the Nazis, picking up much of the loss from the Liberals and the other right parties to become the largest party. But even in 1933, the socialist and communist turnouts are still pretty much in line with the previous 3 elections. It was the liberal bourgeois parties, and those who believed in and voted with their politics, who collapsed in the face of the growing Nazi support, which again seems to support the idea that, for many on the liberal side, Nazism seemed like a worthwhile risk to ensure the protection of the economic and class system they were invested in. It seems many may have answered the appeal to the bourgeois we saw from thinkers like Pareto in the last video, and come to assert their class interests by force. Of course, after all this, it was the establishment president, Paul von Hindenburg, who finally, if grudgingly, allowed Hitler to form a government, and to take emergency powers in the aftermath of the Reichstag fire. But I can hear some detractors saying, wasn't it also liberals in the UK and America who stopped the Nazis? And, although we must acknowledge the massive role of the Soviet Union, who lost the most lives and suffered a brutal invasion, yes, liberal regimes were also key in defeating fascism, but not everyone in these regimes was so keen to jump in straight away. We have already heard how big businesses were keen to work with Hitler, and upper classes around the world, even in Britain and America, contained sections sympathetic to the Nazis. Here in the UK, the Daily Mail newspaper cheered on Oswald Mosley and his Black Shirt movement, the British Union of Fascists. Mosley was, by the way, himself a British aristocrat, the 6th Baronet of Ancoats, and it seems this culture of support went higher into the aristocracy. In 2015, a video emerged from 1933 showing King Edward VIII teaching the royal children, including his niece Elizabeth, now the Queen, to do a Nazi salute. This atmosphere of support for fascism seems to have permeated much of the British upper class. Many saw fascism in Central Europe as a useful bulwark against the, somewhat unsuccessful in my view, communist project in the Soviet Union. Unsurprisingly perhaps, given our examination of him so far, we find this attitude well expressed in Churchill. Italy has shown that there is a way of fighting the subversive forces which can rally the masses of the people, properly led, to value and wish to defend the honour and stability of stabilised society. She has provided the necessary antidote to the Russian poison. Hereafter, no great nation will be unprovided with an ultimate means of protection against the cancerous growth of Bolshevism. So Churchill here, completely in line with our critique, likes the idea that fascism provides a solution to class struggle which suits the ruling class liberal bourgeois capitalist interests. We see this in the works of contemporary British novelist Evelyn Waugh,
Good God, y'all!
who clearly observed the class nature of fascism, saying, "Fascism is a growth of certain peculiar soils. Principally, it needs two things: a frightened middle class who see themselves in danger of extinction in a proletarian state, and some indignant patriots who believe that their country, through internal dissension, is becoming bullied by the rest of the world. In England we had something like a fascist movement in 1926, when the middle classes broke the general strike. We have a middle class that is uniquely apt for strenuous physical adventures, amenable to discipline, bursting with esprit de corps, and a great fund of patriotism. It is quite certain that England would become fascist before it became communist. It is quite unlikely to become either." And if that quote left you in any doubt about which side Waugh saw himself on, he clarifies for us. "If I were a Spaniard, I should be fighting for General Franco. As an Englishman, I am not in the predicament of choosing between two evils. I am not a fascist, nor shall I become one unless it were the only alternative to Marxism. It is mischievous to suggest that such a choice is imminent." So Waugh clearly sees his class interests as aligned with fascism, and, though he feels he has the privilege of not becoming a fascist in his current situation, clearly declares that, were a threat to his class to emerge, he would happily adopt fascism. And this is a position that seems reflected in the British state's response to the Spanish Civil War. While the Republic and its communist and anarchist allies called for aid, the major Western countries, both fascist and liberal, signed a non-interference treaty, a treaty that was broken continuously by Germany and Italy, who sent fascist air forces and soldiers to aid Franco's army, while the liberals of France and Britain did nothing to protect the Republic, did not punish the fascists for breaking the treaty, or break it themselves. Perhaps this is the ultimate act of they go low, we go high, and it allowed Franco to take Spain and usher in decades of fascist dictatorship. This seems utterly in line with people like Waugh's sympathy for fascism, while not wanting to get their hands dirty. In terms of Landa's title here, Waugh is literally the Apprentice, voicing his preparedness to call upon his fascist sorcerer to control the unruly brooms should the need arise. The American historian Carol Quigley even implies that, were it not for the public opinion of the lower classes, who clearly opposed fascism, the British elites would have been reluctant to enter the war. The fear of Hitler's using war was based not so much on a dislike of force, neither Lothian nor Halifax was a pacifist in that sense, but on the realization that if Hitler made war against Austria, Czechoslovakia or Poland, public opinion in France and England might force their governments to declare war, in spite of their desire to yield these areas to Germany. This, of course, is what finally happened. This, indeed, seems to have been the position of Neville Chamberlain's appeasement-orientated pre-war British government. Their hope seems to have been for Czechoslovakia to give way, allowing a corridor to the east which avoided Poland, with whom they had a treaty, and would allow the Nazi war machine to attack the hated USSR without stepping on the toes of British imperial interests. This position is clearly expressed in the words of Neville Henderson, the British ambassador to Nazi Berlin under Chamberlain's government from 1937 to 1939, and notice that he even uses some good old British racism to back up his point. To put it bluntly, the German is certainly more civilized than the Slav, and in the end, if properly handled, also less potentially dangerous to British interests. One might even go so far as to assert that it is not even just to endeavour to prevent Germany from completing her unity, or from being prepared for war against the Slavs, provided her preparations are such as to reassure the British Empire that they are not simultaneously designed against it. So at this point, I think we can see how, in historical examples, liberal forces both inside and outside fascist nations have often supported the rise of fascism and recognised its alignment with their class interests. And this is the real thrust of Landa's argument in The Apprentice's Sorcerer. However, since the book's publication, a lot has happened, and certainly my interest in the topic is less about what it says about the past, and more about what it says about our present. One of the first times I started thinking about the relationship between fascism and liberalism was back in 2016. I was watching the rise of Donald Trump in the election, and saw the apparent liberal outcry, and I thought, is anything he's really saying unprecedented in the last decade or so of liberalism? I mean, it's more open and more intense, but I realised his platform is kinda built by taking all the dark implications of recent liberal agendas and pushing them to their logical conclusion. So, life story aside, let's unpack what I'm saying here a bit. As many have commented, Trump plays on the fears of many in America, their fear of Muslims, their fear of migrants, their fear of countries like North Korea and Iran. But how did these people come to be afraid of these things? Well, it was the liberal establishment. I don't think it's unfair to say that a huge amount of our public discourse and policy since 9/11 has been justified on the basis of fears inspired by that event. Fears of terrorism, of security risks, and of the other, especially the Muslim other. This has led to increasing manifestations of those fears. I mean, should we be surprised that, for example, people who grew up in countries where they are constantly told to fear Muslim terrorists, and where their country continually invades Muslim countries, might not find it easier to come to the idea that all Muslims are somehow bad? Now, the statements of liberals regularly stop short of these implications, but the subtext is there. And then, it is again unsurprising that people read these implications and start to feel that the government is tricking them, trying to downplay the threat. And when someone like Trump comes and says, yeah, that's exactly what they're doing, you're right, Muslims are all bad, then you can see these people might eat that up. Since the war on terror, also, many liberal governments have been happy to tighten immigration and even build stretches of border wall, as there is around the small Spanish territory of Ceuta on the edge of Morocco, to prevent immigration over one of the EU's only land borders with Africa. Increased militarism in our culture, with propaganda phrases like support the troops being drummed into us, also offers tools for fascism to pick up, as does increased surveillance culture justified on security grounds. The support the troops phrase is interesting here. It is designed to have an emotional appeal which is difficult to argue against. No one wants troops to die, but which distracts from the true question of the morality of the war they are fighting in. Using these emotional propaganda techniques to sidestep reason is also a tactic which, in my view, prepares the population to make these reactionary emotional judgments, again increasing their susceptibility to fascism. From Blair in the first decade of this century to Hillary Clinton just the other day, we have seen a huge amount of this triangulation with the right, which we saw the SVP attempt disastrously in Germany, trying to win votes from the far right by adopting soft racist policies on things like immigration. This was especially convenient during the financial crash, as scapegoating migrants in the media was a great way to distract from the flagrant abuses of the financial system which had caused the crash, and the fact that it was resolved, or partially resolved, by bailing out the people at the top who caused it, those liberal capitalists of the bourgeois trading class, at the expense of the masses. And, well, the last 10, 15, 20 years of triangulation certainly hasn't worked if the aim was to defang the far right. Every immigration reform just results in more calls for the same, and the far right grows. In fact, I believe this triangulation has the opposite effect. By giving credibility to their views by showing government is responding to them, it makes it seem more like these imagined problems are real, or that real problems are caused by these fictional effects, like immigrants taking your jobs, and therefore allows the right not only to be seen as right when they are wrong, but also to say the government will not go far enough, and only they, the ones shouting the loudest about the issue, can truly enact the reforms needed. Triangulating with the right is a bad idea. It only makes them stronger and you weaker. Remember the SVP. They triangulated and shrank to 2 seats in 1933, as much of their remaining base, who hadn't yet joined the Nazis, encouraged them as a party to join the Nazis. I'm not saying Trump is exactly an explicit fascist. That is a different debate, but this doesn't matter so much in this argument. What matters here is that, in class terms, he is playing the same game. He is offering an authoritarian, reactionary solution to paper over the class divide and preserve the liberal economic interests. We can see this agenda in his cabinet selection, draining the swamp of corporate America into his government. Trump was at pains to make his laissez-faire, low-tax, low-regulation position clear in a White House speech to the business community at a meeting he had with top capitalists early in his presidency, when he reassures them that he is there for their interests.
This is really our first official meeting, and Andrew, it's nice to have you set everything up so well, and I hear your company's doing well.
Thank you.
You are great people. You've done an amazing job. Now, what we're doing is we are going to be cutting taxes massively. We're trying to get it down to anywhere from 15 to 20%, and it's now 35%, but it's probably more 38% than it is 35, wouldn't you say? That's a big thing. A bigger thing, and that surprised me, is the fact that we're going to be cutting regulation massively. We think we can cut regulations by 75%, maybe more.
I'm not trying to concoct a conspiracy theory here. I'm not saying that liberals schemed to bring back fascism. It certainly isn't always their intention for it to go that far. J.S. Mill, for example, despite his anti-democratic sentiments explored in Part 2, explicitly rejected supporting a strongman dictator, quote, forcibly seizing on the government of the world and making it do his bidding in spite of itself, as a solution. No, this is generally not so much a conspiracy as an often unintended consequence. That is to say that liberals, for their own ends, built a number of tools perfect for fascism, and then just left them lying around so that fascism was able to come along, pick them up, and run with them. It's not always the intention of liberals that brings about fascism, but their negligence and their blindness to any cure to society's problems which may disrupt their class interests in maintaining the status quo. This negligence has led not only to Trump, but to the re-emergence of authoritarianism and far-right movements around the world. Of course, a great example to illustrate this right now is Brazil, where the bourgeois establishment concocted a sort of legalistic coup to bring down the moderate left president Dilma Rousseff, even though she was not herself implicated in the corruption scandal, in order to regain control of the government from the moderately socialist Brazilian Workers' Party, who had ruled since 2003. After her fall, they still worried that the Workers' Party could beat them at an election, so they stalled elections and made sure the most popular Workers' Party candidate, Rousseff's predecessor, Lula da Silva, was charged with corruption to avoid him running. The Liberals conspired to crush even the most moderate social democratic force, and when the elections finally came, with the Workers' Party in disarray, what finally happened? A supposed outsider candidate, Jair Bolsonaro, who favoured the old military dictatorship and who talks about cleansing Brazil of leftists, emerges to take the presidency, backed by a nominally socially liberal party. It's literally called the Social Liberal Party, while seemingly being one of the most fascistic of the new far-right leaders to have emerged in this current reactionary wave. And now in power, his cabinet is set to be full of military chiefs, and he's appointed to the Treasury a hardline neoliberal Chicago boy economist, Paulo Guedes. I could list many more examples of this, ways in which recent governments have laid the groundwork for the far right by continuing to try and patch the class divide with social liberalism, nationalism, and militarism, all subservient to their economic system which maintains the class system in the first place, and constantly setting up systems and narratives which offer effective tools to a would-be fascist, from crushing unions to racist propaganda. But I think the examples are so profuse, if you think about it, you can probably come up with hundreds for yourself. Certainly much of what I covered in episode 3 can be seen in this light. But another worrying trend I'd like to come to here is the rise of the many ideologues, who today are laying the ground for a very similar transformation of liberalism to the more extreme defence of its class structure, inciting the liberals to reject their social values.
The worst case scenario for the alt-right success in this endeavour is less intolerable to me and my family than the SJW success, even if it means the end of liberal democracy. Even if it means the end of liberal democracy.
People like Jordan Peterson, Sargon of Akkad, Stefan Molyneux, and Paul Joseph Watson, to name but a few, regularly trot out tracts reminiscent of quotes we saw from actual fascists and proto-fascists earlier. And certainly we can see these people as engaged in a similar project of rolling back social reforms and opposing socialism to defend the current economic status quo. One thing I found most chilling when first reading Landa's book, and again when researching these videos, is just how similar some of the old fascist and proto-fascist rhetoric is to what we see today. Are these people fascists or liberals? That's for them to know, and if they are fascists, we have no guarantee many of them would tell us. As pointed out in episode 4, lying is an essential part of fascism, even up to misrepresenting your own ideology. But they are certainly engaged in a project with the same direction of travel within the liberal framework as we have examined it here, along the economic axis, at the expense of the social. And whatever ideas they have, I would say that ideas along those lines are generally deeply abhorrent and need to be opposed. As a little example, here's Peterson defending Hitler as bringing order and greatness to the chaos after the communist revolution in Russia, softly praising Nazis for stabilizing the status quo in the face of socialist threats to property. Absolutely in line with our analysis here.
The Germans had plenty of reason to be resentful and hateful because, I mean, think about what they went through. We can't even imagine it. First of all, there was World War I, and so there was many men, like Hitler himself, who served in the trenches. And then the hyperinflation hits, and every single person in Germany who ever saved any money at all is flat, bloody broke. And then there's a communist revolution brewing in Russia, and it's like, it's hell. And the Nazis came along and said, well, not only are we going to restore order and greatness, but we're going to bloody well tell you whose fault this is.
So there you have it. Peterson justifying the Nazis in terms that any Nazi, I think, would be very happy to justify themselves in. So let's finally get to the point of all this. And if you followed this series all the way from the beginning, then wow, we've been on quite a journey. From the forming of the bourgeois capitalist nexus out of Western imperialist trade, through to the roots of modern fascism. So what is the ultimate point I'm trying to make? To begin with, I would like to point out what I think is the pure theoretical use of this argument. By analysing liberalism through the terms explored here, we have been able to see that liberalism fails to live up to its most commonly associated claims, that being the values of liberty, equality, fraternity, democracy, and so on. And further, we can diagnose a key problem which seems to motivate this: the inherent reliance of liberalism as a philosophy and as a class structure on the exploitative economics of capitalism and the politics of war and power. And when we analyse fascism on these same terms, this analysis reveals a continuum between liberal and fascist ideas, again characterised by devotion to these economic principles and the resultant demand to maintain the class status quo. And this gives us a tool with which to analyse new ideas and assess their trajectory relative to liberalism, as well as to highlight the horrific results of an extreme commitment to the capitalist economic tendency. This also tells us something about fascism and the conditions under which it forms, its direct opposition to socialism, and the way liberalism can, due to their continuities, easily provide the tools that the far right can then pick up and run with to disastrous effects. But this is not just a negative analytic tool, it also highlights the continuities between liberalism and socialism, allowing us to see a way out of this crisis in a way that moves away from the possibility of fascism, by embracing liberalism's social goals in the broad terms we associate with it: democracy, liberty, equality, community, and all these things, and running with these in the other direction, following them through properly, abandoning capitalism and private property, in order to embrace equality and move out of liberalism into the socialist region of our diagram here. Beyond just the purely theoretical, though, I think this analysis also illuminates something important about our societies today. So let's now look at what that is. Well, first, I think that since 1945, we have, as a society, failed to properly deal with the legacy of fascism. We have tried to alienate fascism from ourselves as this horrific monstrosity which is unrecognisable to our kinder societies. And I can see why. Fascism is horrific, disgusting and monstrous, but it is also not so alien from our world today. This disavowal of fascism can be seen again as a liberal project. Fascism emerged as a result of class conflict, and of the fundamental contradictions in the liberal canon which are exposed by class conflict. But liberalism is, as we have examined, a philosophy whose interests are historically grounded in the interests of the bourgeois class, who gained prominence through capitalism. And so its major response, especially after the end of Keynesianism in the 1970s, has been to return to the old social liberal strategy of papering over class conflict by attesting to its universal values, but rarely following them, to mask the exploitative effects of the class system. The result was the continued imminent possibility of a return to fascism. In fact, one could argue that leaving the contradictions of liberalism unaddressed meant the eventual return of fascism was inevitable. Further, this path was made more dangerous with the massive intensification of militarist, nationalist, and racialized discourses that proliferated throughout the liberal establishment in the aftermath of 9/11, and in the choice, at least by many media establishments, to scapegoat immigrants for economic woes forced upon workers by the liberal elite to pay for the collapse of their capitalist economic model. And yes, I say liberal elites. If you're on the right, and let's face it, there's no way you are if you watched this far, but just in case, then I agree. There is a liberal elite who are trying to control you, but they're not socialist. This isn't some cultural Marxism conspiracy theory. They are capitalist. I mean, Donald Trump is a businessman who has donated to both parties in pretty much every election in recent history. He is part of that establishment. He may have some whacked out social views, but he is there to protect the economic interests of the very people who caused your problems. Nigel Farage in the UK is a former City of London banker who made his riches on the stock market. These people aren't outsiders. They are of the system. They just have to appear as outsiders to try and gain mass support through their deceptive tactics. And, though many wouldn't admit it publicly, many liberal politicians and business people, certainly on the right, would much rather see them have their way than even the slightest hint of a serious socialist effort to deal with this problem at the root cause by redistributing wealth to eradicate the contradictions of class. Incidentally, not many people seem to know this these days, but radical literally means getting to the root of a problem. It doesn't mean extreme, and given that, I think our policies should always aim to be radical, to solve things at the root, and in our society, that root is not migration, or supposed feminist conspiracies, or the Jews, or cultural Marxism, or the general softening of attitudes to difference that the right complain about. It's class, hierarchy, and structures of oppression towards gendered, racial, sexual, and other minorities. A famous quote, of unknown origin as far as I know, but often incorrectly attributed to American writer Sinclair Lewis, says that, "When fascism comes, it will be wrapped in the flag and carrying the cross." Well, I would contend that what we see here, in those terms, is a liberal tendency to blindly hand fascism the cross, and unwittingly wrap the flag around it themselves. So what do I think we should do? Well, we need to realise that to prevent fascism, we have to move beyond the contradictions of class that cause it, and that means we need socialism. If we solve the disparities of economic and political power that produce both the people who want to protect their exploitative positions and those who suffer from it but are led astray to identify the cause of their suffering not in the system but in some aberration which is stopping it functioning, often a racial or political other, would not exist. Not because they'd be dead, you understand? This isn't some leftist variant of Nazi purification philosophy, but because they would have equal access to the resources and political influence, and of course education, so the former would have no position to protect, and the latter would have no axe to grind, and both would have good conditions of life guaranteed by society. We must also be wary of building narratives and structures that rely on a culture of militarism, nationalism, xenophobia, or authoritarianism, as all of these can be easily taken up by the right and used as a weapon against society. Also, they're shit, aren't they? I mean, why would you want to build an ideology around these things? They're shit.
I am the great mighty Pooh, and I'm going to throw my shit at you.
And we should really do something about all the damage we have been doing by imperialism, direct or indirect, for the last few centuries, both on the level of stopping the exploitation of poorer countries and acknowledging the harm that has been done to them in our national conversation. Here in Britain, in 2014, a YouGov poll found that 59% of Britons thought the empire was something to be proud of, compared to only 19% who felt it was shameful. And it is shameful. Going around the world, committing numerous genocides, oppressing millions and stealing their resources, that's something to be ashamed of. Perhaps it speaks to the success of liberals in keeping the dark sides of their and our history hidden from view. I think we could learn from Germany here. After the war there was a huge cultural shock, and the previous 12 years of German life was now a terrifying aberration of history. While they did not solve the class problem, they did spend a lot of time dealing with this history, and to celebrate it was generally considered disgusting, for a few decades at least. It was slow and painful, but Germans did have to confront their history. And for us it need not be quite as painful, maybe? A lot of the British land empire happened a long time ago, although we're still very much engaged in economic and military imperialism. But to sing the praises of Britannia ruling the waves, rather than facing up to the dark sides of our legacy, only leads us to be blind to our own complicity in current and future actions, like the economically motivated wars in the Middle East, or our wider web of debt and economic imperialist structures around the world, through which we still extract resources and cheap labour from people in impoverished countries that were once direct colonies of European powers, and which keep these countries poor. A good exploration of how this works can be found in the journalist John Pilger's documentary, War by Other Means. Link in the description.
Remember Live Aid in 1985, that symbol of concern and generosity? Did you know that during that year, the hungriest countries in Africa gave twice as much money to us in the developed world as we gave to them? There was another famine last year. Perhaps you were one of those who took part in Red Nose Day. Did you know that before that day was over, the equivalent of all the money that Comic Relief had raised in Britain, about £12 million, had come back to the rich countries? For every day this amount is given by the poorest to the rich, has interest payments on loans that most of them never asked for or knew existed. In other words, contrary to a myth long popular in the West, it's been the poor of the world who've financed the rich, not the other way round.
There are no bullets, but it's a war in which people are dying.
War and debt are exactly the same thing, except for one point, which is that nobody needs to occupy territory today.
In the 1980s, the World Bank and IMF and the US government and the British government would say to developing countries, you cut government spending, you increase exports, you privatize, or you won't get new loans.
Belt tightening is what it's called. What you do is tighten those notches that are easiest to pull. Those notches that affect children, that affect poor people, that affect people who have no power in a political system.
Part of the design of structural adjustment programs, that's what these policies are called, is to drive down real wages.
Not only the banks, but in fact the public institutions have received a total of over $1.3 trillion. That's 1.3 followed by about 12 zeros. And the reward that the debtor countries have received for paying their creditors $1.3 trillion in the last 10 years is to be more than 60% more in debt than they were in 1982. So if there is no change, this can go on forever.
Only by facing up to the dark side of our own society and our own history, by seriously seeking to solve these problems in good faith, to follow up on those liberal values of equality, liberty and fraternity, by making them truly universal, overcoming the contradictions of liberalism to really enact these values, can we both work to prevent fascism and build a better society for all of us? So my appeal is, I guess, to liberals, not as a falling ruling class, but as the custodians of these social and political enlightenment values that we share. Join us. If you truly value these great social values and political rights purported by liberalism, then you need socialism to save them, and to save us all from tyranny. We see this playing out in material reality. Look at these polls for Bernie Sanders if he had faced Donald Trump. Even his own pollsters admitted Sanders would have won. Sanders offered real solutions, if moderate by my politics, but he offered a direction of travel that was concerned with addressing class conflict, setting a trajectory to the social and political rather than the economic exit from the liberal contradictions. And he would have beaten Trump. But to the liberal establishment of the Democratic Party, it seems beating him was more important than beating Trump. When it comes to a choice between a right-wing demagogue or a socialist, all too often the liberals will choose the demagogue. They may not like it, but it will protect their property and status, and so they rush to its side. This, I noticed when making the video, is actually weirdly well represented by the fishhook theory meme, which is really just a joke about how ridiculous horseshoe theory, the idea that the extreme left and extreme right are basically the same, is. But actually, and maybe this is more of a jokey point, but I think if we look at it in light of this analysis, it does seem quite true to this argument, in a crude way. The right and centre are locked in the spiral of the status quo, while those on the left are trying to show the way out. And to the left, I'm not saying liberals are evil, and we shouldn't engage with them. And there are times when, if they are willing to participate in good faith, it may be necessary to work with them to prevent specific fascist outbreaks. But we must make these arguments, and demand they participate in coalitions which do not just offer the same worn-out liberal solutions, which will just leave the wound of class to fester. We must demand that they recognise that to save their system, they need us, and we need libertarian socialism. The sharing of power and resources among everyone, for the good of all, as well as the intersectional discourses, to ensure that in our society we all have the same rights and recognition, whatever our race, sexuality or gender, be it cis or trans or anything between. These are the real discourses of liberty, equality and solidarity which offer us a way to live together and share the fruits of our advanced society's achievements in communal luxury. These are not simple times. We are once again at the sharp end of the liberal split, where its contradictions are becoming increasingly difficult to hide. And, as in the 20s and 30s, the worst kind of political threat is coming out of the shadows. The return of far-right politics, acting on the principles we just examined, whether exasperated to the point of outright fascism or not, is no longer a threat, a worry on the horizon, but a very concrete reality in our communities, and already for some, like in the Philippines, where Duterte wants to kill as many drug dealers as Hitler did Jews, Hungary, where Viktor Orban's government have removed judicial independence, banned any aid to refugees, including food, shelter, clothing and legal aid, or to campaign for migrant rights, which they called the Stop Soros Law, highlighting their genuine anti-Semitic tendencies, and introduced a new slave law allowing employers to make workers work unpaid hours, to name but a few things. Not to mention Brazil, and even America. This is already a fact of power in their governments.
I'm sad to say, but I think this is probably the last chance to show the Hungarian people that it's worth to show your opinion. I'm afraid that next year we will not have the possibility to show our opinion.
If we are going to stop it, we need to show the way out of this spiral, out of an eternal class struggle from the contradictions of liberalism's two-faced nature. We need socialism, and we need to work fast, because the alternative is unthinkable. So, here we are. That's it. What a wild ride it's been. Thanks if you've watched this all the way through from episode 1. It's been a long journey, but I think it's an important point, so I wanted to make it as clearly and well as possible, and, well, 3 initially planned episodes turned into 5, and here we are. But I hope you think it was worth it, and maybe I was able to highlight some things you didn't know. Let me know in the comments, and if you really enjoyed it, why not give me $1 or so on Patreon? This video series took an absurd amount of time to make, and living under capitalism, I need to eat and have a roof over my head and stuff like that to continue making things like this. So if you want more content like this, then any donations you give would really help. So if you like this content and you want more, then this is where you support the channel. On that note, I'd like to thank my current patrons: Emily Dickinson, Natty, Zabezian, Baffy, Brett Long, Daniel Stenson, Geshtin, Sinead Kerwin, The Cooler Noah, and Thought Slime. I'd like to offer extra special thanks to George Soros and Peter Benzoni. You guys are amazing, and thanks for having so much faith in this channel so early on. I'd also like to thank my co-conspirator, Blue Legenda, for doing all the original graphic design and animation for these videos. They're a huge part of making this happen and making it look good, so thanks to them. Also, I forgot to mention this in the last video, but apologies to the West Country of England for giving Hitler your accent. No offence meant. So, that's the end of the Dark Side of Liberalism series. I just want to say something here. I've had a bit of a charmed life to start this channel due to a close bereavement, and this has allowed me to support myself for a little bit. But I do have to make some money, and so I'm going to be starting a job again very shortly. So the videos will be less frequent for a little bit, but I still intend to release at least one a month. And if you've enjoyed having this much content from me, and you want them to come more frequently again, well, the more money I get on Patreon, the more time I can spend on this. That's a sad fact of survival in this system, I'm afraid. I'd love to spend all my time doing this, and with your donations, I can spend a lot more time on it. But all that said, I'm not going anywhere, and do hope to have another video out on a new topic in about a month. So I hope to see you then. So that's basically it. Please like, share and subscribe and all of these things. Because this channel is still quite small, I'd really like to share these ideas with a wider audience. I really care about these ideas and helping them reach people, and if you do too, then all of this sharing and liking and stuff really helps. So thanks everyone, you're all amazing, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!